Hello, this is Basar. In this tutorial, we are going to see how we can use the middleware functionality of Express. As usual, we have this repository right here, and we will be starting from this middleware start branch, and we will be doing our changes, and the final version of the tutorial can be found in this middleware final branch. You can just clone this one and follow the steps we are going to do in this tutorial. I've already cloned this repository, so let's open that one in Visual Studio Code. And here I'm on middleware start branch. And let's go over the project structure first. So we have the dependencies of Express, Sequelize, and SQLite. And we have this start script, which is running the application in watch mode with this nodemon library. So whenever we do any changes in the source, the application is automatically restarted. And the application logic is right here in this index.js. We have this Express application created right here, and we have the Sequelize for accessing to the database. We have the SQLite database. And here we are creating 5 users and saving it with this user model we have here. So this is a Sequelize model, and we have these fields in the user table, and we are saving these users to our database initially. And we have the endpoints for posting, getting, updating, and deleting user. And in previous tutorials, we have seen how we can introduce these functionalities. Also, we have seen how we can handle the exception cases in the Express applications. And in previous tutorial, when we are handling this exception cases, we introduced this functionality right here. Whenever a request is received for retrieving a user with specified ID, here we are checking if this user ID is really a number, and if it is not, we are throwing this exception. And we just did this check in this get handler, but similarly we have the same use cases right here in the put mapping and the delete mapping. So the user's ID is number, and we should be doing same control in each of them. And in these cases, instead of repeating ourselves, we can use the middleware functionality of the Express. And we are going to do that right now. Now let's run our application first, opening a terminal and running npm start. The application is initialized, and if we go to Postman and send a request to this endpoint, so there are 5 users. And if I try to get the user first, this user 1, we are receiving this user object. But if I type instead of a number like this string, here I am receiving this error message, and this message is triggered right here in this control. We are checking if this parameter, this ID, is not a number, and if it's not, we are throwing this exception, and this exception is handled and mapped to the error object like this. Now, if we try to do the same thing for the other endpoints like this one, this put endpoint or the delete endpoint, for instance, let's send a put request to this endpoint. Here the request is stuck because this ID is being queried in table. We are trying to find a user with this ID. We are not able to find that user, and this is undefined object, and we are trying to update this undefined object username field and running its save method. So that's causing exceptions right here, and the scenario is failing. So we can just throw the same error like the invalid ID exception in this endpoint, and also we should be doing the same thing in the delete mapping, and we are going to do that with the middleware now. First canceling this request. Now let's create a function for this one. Middleware is basically a function, and we can define a function right here let's say this is the name of the function. Let's say it's going to be ID number control. And in this function, just like we are having the function handling, route handling function like this one, here we will be taking request and response parameters, and also we will take the next. Now we can just copy and paste this part to this function. So basically this ID number control will be taking the ID parameter coming in the request, and it will check if it is number or not. If it's not number, it's going to be throwing this exception to the next. And we can use this function right here in this app get handling definition. This get function, or the others like the post and put, are taking multiple parameters, and the first one is the path, and the others are route handling functions or middlewares. So we can add multiple functions here, and we can do it like this, just adding the function name here, and that's it. So whenever a request is received to this endpoint for this method, first of all this function will be called with the request, response, and the next parameters, and it's going to be doing its thing. Then if everything is fine, then the next function we defined inline here, this is going to be called, and we will be handling what we are supposed to do in this one. So this ID number control will be making sure this ID in the request is really a number, so we don't need to do the same control here anymore, and we don't need to parse this one to integer. We don't need to do same steps. So basically we are taking the ID from parameters, and we know it is number. We are sure about it because the middleware is running before our handler. So the rest of the logic is fine. And just like using this one in this get mapping, we can use same thing for the put mapping and delete mapping. So this middleware function will be working before our actual route handling functions. By the way, instead of defining the function like this, we can use arrow function. So it's going to be something like this one, the arrow function definition. The function is taking these parameters, and the implementation of the function is like this. So saving this one. And let's go back to Postman. Now sending a put request to these users. And here we are receiving this invalid ID error response. And if I try to send a request with the delete method, and I'm receiving the same response. So this logic we extracted right here is now used for these endpoints. And basically this is called as the middleware function. And if you have watched the previous tutorial about the exception handling, we were passing this exception via this next function. We did that because our handling functions was async. That's why the only way to make our exception handler we defined right here to be kicked in for these exceptions with just passing that exception to next. But in this middleware function, there is nothing asynchronous in this one. So instead of passing the exception to next, we can just throw this exception like this. Let's save this, and let's try with Postman. Sending this request, we are receiving the error. Sending the put request, again we are receiving this error. So the middleware function is working, and it is throwing exception whenever this ID is not a number. So with this way we are adding our middleware function running before our actual route handler function. So we can extract the repeating functionalities and reuse them for other handlers. But let's see what happens when we send our request with an ID having number. So let's send an request to this endpoint with the ID having the number. Now we are stuck in this request once again. We are not receiving a response. Let's cancel this one and let's try with get endpoint. Again, this is stuck. And the reason is, in our middleware function, this request is stuck at this point. We are checking if the ID is not a number, but this condition is not matching. Therefore, the function is stopping at this point and doesn't know what to do. This third parameter is basically calling the next function in the chain. So this ID number control is right here, positioned right before this route handling function. So if we are okay, or if we want this request to continue to the next handler, this next function, we have to call just next here. So this next will be calling the next function coming after this ID number control. And if the request is get mapping, the next function is this one. And if the request is for this put or the delete, the next functions are these ones. So in middleware, we have to call the next to make sure the requests will reach to the next handlers. Let's save this one. And if we try with the postman, here sending the request, this is the user first, the user one with this ID. And if we send a request with the delete, here it is saying the user is removed. And if we try to get the user, here we are receiving the user not found because the user is just removed from the database. So this ID number control is working for each of these endpoints. In this get users endpoint, we have demonstrated how we can use the pagination. And here we are doing a couple of controls which are not actually specific to this users endpoint. We are taking the query parameters of page and size and checking if they are really a number. If they are, we are checking the boundaries. They must be greater than 0 and they must be lower than some of the values we are defining right here. And in the end, we are setting the boundaries for the page and size values, and we use that values in the query for the user table. So just like this user table, we can have another endpoint for, let's say, the articles. Let's create that one first. Let's say we will have article.js, and this is going to be similar to this user. Let's copy the things here and paste here. So this is going to be for article model, and we will be initializing this article with the fields. Let's say we will have only one field, and that's going to be content. This article, we will have the content field only, and this article model name will be article. And let's make sure the timestamps are automatically added to this table, and we are going to export this article model. Now let's add a couple of articles to our database first. We can use this function right here. The database is initialized and we are inserting users, and just like inserting users, we can insert articles. But first let's get the article model. We get it from this article, and let's create article, and we have content in it, and the value is, let's say this is going to be article content for this number. Let's also increase this size. Let's make sure we have like 15 articles, and we will save these articles to the database with the article create method. So as soon as our application is initialized, we will have 15 users and 15 articles in the database. And since we want the pagination to be applied, just like we have in this get users, we will do the same thing for the articles, just copying and pasting here. So this is going to be for articles. We will check the page number, the size number, then we will be running query with the article models find and count all. And let's rename this variable to articles with count. So saving these changes. Now going back to Postman. So let's see how the users are working. So we are receiving 10 users per page, and there are 2 pages. And if we go to page 1, initially the page is 0, and if we go to the next page, which is page 1, here we are receiving the users from 11 to 15. And similarly, if we go to the articles, here we are receiving the articles from 11 to 15, and if we go back to page 0, here we are receiving these articles from 1 to 10. So the article endpoint has the pagination functionality, but obviously we just copied and pasted the functionality of checking the existence of this page and size parameters in the request. So just like extracting this ID control we have done here, we can do the same thing for this pagination. And let's do that. Let's have a function right here. Let's call this one as pagination. Again, this is going to be taking request, response, and the next. And we can do these controls in this pagination function. So let's cut this part from this get users and paste here. Now we are checking the query parameters. We are setting the page and size values. We either go with the default or the user provided values. Then what we can do is we can update this request object, so the next function can pull the paginations from that request object and do whatever it's supposed to do based on that values. So let's do it something like this. Let's say in request we will have a pagination object, and this pagination object will have the page field, and it's going to be having this value, and we will also have the size field, and that's going to be having this value. And instead of this definition, we can use with the object shorthand functionality of JavaScript, because the key of the object and the value is having the same text. So instead of repeating it twice, we can just go like this. So this is going to be generating an object having page and size fields, and these fields will have the corresponding values assigned to them. And the next part is we will call next. So the next function, this next handler, will run. So we can use this pagination right before our get users handler. So the pagination will do the controls and will update the request object to have the pagination object, which will have page and size values. They can be default values or the values coming for the user. So then here in this function, we can get those pagination values. We can use the object destructuring to get those values. So we can get the page and size coming from requests pagination object. So we added this pagination to request right here in this pagination middleware, and we are taking the page and size values from this pagination object from the request, and the rest of the code is fine. And we can do the same thing for the articles. Again, we will use the pagination middleware and just removing this part, since that control is done in the pagination middleware. Now we can just pull the page and size values from request pagination object. Now saving this one too, going back to Postman, here sending the request, here we are receiving the articles, and if I change the values to, let's say the size will be 3, and by default the page is 0, so we are receiving this result. And if I change the page to 3, here I am receiving the users from 10 to 12. And same thing also applies to this users endpoint. Here we are receiving the users from 10 to 12. We are also using another middleware right here, this one, Express.json, and this is working in each request, and it is taking the request body and parsing it as a JSON object and adding it to the request and passing it to the next functions, which are this REST endpoints. Another use case could be security scenarios. We can have middleware function to be checking some headers in the incoming request and validate the values in the header before forwarding that request to the next handlers. So whenever you are repeating yourself in multiple handlers, then you should be using this middleware functionality to reduce the code size, but also increase the code readability. So with this way, let's check this one, for instance. We are making sure this endpoint is receiving a request where the ID is controlled before reaching to us. So we are sure this ID is really a number. Or in this one, we are looking for pagination values and we are receiving pagination values. User may or may not be passing any request query parameters for the page, but this pagination middleware will have default values like this one, the 0 and 10. So we will be having these pagination values in our route handler. Currently, this middleware for the pagination is working for these two endpoints, but just like this Express.json, we can define the middlewares which will be running in each request. So let's say we will have a function like this one. This will run in every request, and it is taking request, response, and next. And let's just log running the middleware for, let's say we will log the request method and we will log the request original URL, and we will just call the next. So this middleware will be just logging this thing to console, and we'll call the next function coming after this one. And all we will need to do is app use. So this is going to be used globally, and we will pass this function to it. So saving this one. Now let's open Postman, sending this request, and here we are seeing it's running the middleware for get users. Or let's send a request like this. Here it is saying running the middleware for get users A, or let's try this one too. So this is also working for this endpoint. So we can see this middleware is logging this method and path in every request. So that's all for the middleware part of the Express. Thanks for watching and hope to see you in next tutorials.